The following is a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio. Want the real story behind the sound bites and headlines? Let's find the facts. Remember, it's not a conspiracy theory if it's the truth. You are not paranoid or confused. You just need to know. Welcome in, everybody. It is another edition of Need to Know here on TKR. Keefer with you as per usual as we welcome a new week. Everything going on around us in a swirling fashion, and I am pretty confident to say that we cover a lot of that every week here. But as I prepared for this week's visit with you that I look forward to and hopefully convey some thoughts every week of some pertinence, I get the sense I'll call y'all, let's say it what it is, maybe even from the start of the show, that I've spent an awful lot of time being the guy outside the theater yelling, "Fire, fire, run for your lives." And you know, I feel like I try to offer some solutions and some different things, but I think I'm more the guy that is, you know, trying to call attention to what's happening. And on some levels, that's a little bit frustrating to not have all the answers and not be in a position to of leadership to basically trigger the discussions of solutions to problems instead of just pointing out all of the things that are wrong. And it's not just problems that have developed. These are self-inflicted wounds, as you know from our discussions. And I get a little bit frustrated because, and I don't hear a lot of negative feedback, but every once in a while people will make comments and make reference to my political, you know, kind of opinion of being, it's typecast, of course, as right or conservative or Republican. And if you've heard the show at all, I really kind of just shudder at being typecast, because I don't think that really is where the discussion should be. I don't want my thoughts dismissed because I'm kind of put on a shelf with a label on the jar of what I am, because I really am desperately try to look at things from a pragmatic and, you know, nonpartisan view, and just try to point out things based on, you always hear the words on Need to Know, common sense. And so I decided this week I wanted to go a little bit different direction to more define who I am and where I'm coming from. And I have to harken back a number of years ago in my life to come up with the best example of something to illustrate that. And it gives me a break from, again, just endlessly coming on here and railing against things that I think are completely unacceptable, and urging people to get involved and speak up and become active politically in their communities, or at least socially. And I think it's an interesting approach this week, and it may not work, but I hope you get something out of this to enjoy the show, because I want to talk about the word activism and the concept of liberalism, which will surprise some people who think they've got me identified by the cover of my respective book. And I do have a book, by the way. It's called what does George Clooney have that I ain't got? Keefer stories. And it's very different. If anybody wants to order that, it's where all major books are sold on Amazon and all the other outlets, Barnes and Noble, etc. And that book basically explains a lot about who I am and where I come from. But I want to dip back into that era where a lot of those stories and a lot of that formative material came to be, and talk about today one of my heroes, which might surprise some folks, but I think his approach to things was very influential for me in the early part of my 20s, and and even my teenage years, even in high school. And the individual I'm talking about, again, is somebody that you probably wouldn't expect, because he was probably as effective an activist and what would some would say a liberal as any person that you can name in the last half a century. And the individual's name, and he's certainly known, maybe not on the level of modern day, celebrity music actors, performers, but in his time, he was very well known and very well received. The individual's name was Harry Chapin. Harry Chapin was a singer, songwriter, basically played acoustic guitar, had a couple of his brothers in his band, Steve and Jim, who were both, accomplished musicians and did other things, but they really rose to prominence in the 1970s, as Harry Chapin had a couple of big hit songs, and he talks about those in his music, that all of a sudden he was kind of cast on the scene after really just kind of knocking around. But he was such a unique individual that I think some of his words and some of his deeds, talking about that today, will give some perspective to kind of what I wish that all of us would have more of in this time and place. Harry Chapin was called by Vermont Senator Patrick Leahy the most effective outsider to ever operate in Washington. In the late part of his life, and his life did not last anywhere near as long as it should have, Harry Chapin was tragically killed in 1981 in a terrible auto accident on the Long Island Expressway on July 16th, 1981, at the age of 38 years old. So he came to an abrupt end, and it was pretty shocking, because this guy was so active and so involved in so many things. His big issue, his primary issue in the later parts of his life, when he had achieved some fame, was world hunger, and specifically United States hunger. This is a guy who was succeeding commercially, selling a lot of albums, had packed concerts that he played constantly. The busiest guy in show business, you hear that term a lot, but that really characterized who Harry Chapin was. And it was interesting, in that period of his life, the last 4 or 5 years, he was agreeing to play everywhere and traveling ridiculous amounts of geography. For example, he might be playing in Atlanta on a Thursday night and committed to a Friday gig, maybe in Portland, Oregon, or somewhere outrageous, completely not practical to travel to in that short of time, because those were benefits a lot of times. And he had gotten to the point where he was playing maybe 5 shows out of the 7 days every week, and 3 out of every 4, he donated all the proceeds that he was going to make to whatever cause that he was supporting. And again, hunger was his big deal, and he just could not understand how this country, as abundant in resource and wealth that it is, had people going to bed starving every night, particularly children. And he just made it a crusade. Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976. Harry Chapin saw that as an opportunity to use some of his political connections to start basically lobbying in Washington. And a short time later, a couple of years later, Carter actually started a world hunger subcommittee, consisting, of course, of senators and other high-ranking government officials, and Harry Chapin. And people in Washington said the reason that is because Harry Chapin was so relentless in trying to get attention to the things that he believed in, that people would finally just relent to get him to back off. Bruce Springsteen is another great example, who was just exploding on the scene at that particular time. And of course, he's still going strong now on a successful concert tour at the age of 74. But Springsteen, when Harry Chapin died in 1981, spoke at his memorial service and said, Harry Chapin, with all the love in my heart, was the biggest pain in the ass I've ever dealt with. And he says, but in such a good way, because Harry Chapin's activism was prompting people to get up and join him to do something about problems and not just bitch about it. Let's just put it in the clearest language. So Springsteen said, that Harry was always trying to get him involved in different causes and different benefits. And a lot of times he would finally give in because Harry was not going to take no for an answer. He characterized it in that memorial service as saying that Harry Chapin didn't just want a yes from you, I'll participate, or okay, we'll do something along those lines. You couldn't give him those kind of answers. He wanted a commitment from you. He wanted you to be committed to what he was working on and wanted to get you behind it with the same enthusiasm that he showed. And Springsteen, you just marveled at the fact of what he had gotten done in his time as basically a folk singer that was dismissed by even a lot of the entertainment industry as, just kind of an ordinary Joe. But Harry Chapin was anything but that. And I think it's a great illustration of what activism is and being a liberal, which is a term that's been hijacked and applied to modern day progressive people that are trying for their own agenda and for their own enhancement to overhaul everything. Those people are not liberal. Liberal people are all in favor of doing things for others and trying to make a difference in the world, impacting positively situations. And there's nothing more admirable than somebody that approaches things that way from a selfless perspective of just trying to get things done. Remember the old adage, and I think it's really true, that if you're a young person and not a liberal, you have no heart. And if you're an older person and are not conservative, you have no brain. And I think those are really good illustrations of what exactly the pure meanings of those words are, as opposed to today, where activism and progressivism and the woke movement is all about even violent, demonstrative efforts to get your point across, because the agenda is that it's anti-individual, which goes completely against what the concept of liberalism is. It's to try and centralize power and achieve prominent positions for people that think that they're better than everyone else. They're not doing all the efforts we're watching today from the left, all this globalization, all of this, hysterical approaches, latching on to any kind of social issue to try to advance the agenda. Remember what Rahm Emanuel from the Obama administration said: never miss an opportunity to exploit a crisis. And, again, it's completely the wrong approach. And it's not what we've seen in the history of mankind. When you really want to affect something, activism is not burning down buildings and throwing, Molotov cocktails and rocks at cops. That's not activism. It's not beating up a 20-year-old swimmer from the University of Kentucky who had a problem competing against a man in events, declaring himself a woman, and then having access to their locker room, walking around with all of his God-given parts, claiming to be a female and actually flaunting those, and she spoke up about it, and now she is cast as some kind of terrible villain. And at an event at San Francisco State University 2 weeks ago, was literally accosted after her remarks and thrown to the floor and actually beaten up by all these just insane protesters who are just so keyed up on the trans movement. And it's another area where you see the exploitation of what's happening here. All of the different issues with the politicians being financed and having basically their positions bought with huge infusions of money from all over the country, in states where very little of their campaign funding comes from the people of their own areas. But there are just so many examples of that being considered activism when it is not. It's just sheer bribery. So, the bottom line is, folks, that I wanted to make that distinction. And I also, if you'll indulge me, wanted to point out some lyrics and some things said in some Harry Chapin songs, and just kind of highlight things I know about him that I think would warrant maybe investigation for you. All of his music and some of his greater live performances. And he was such a great live performer, because you talk about a guy who could connect with his audience, sitting there on his stool in the front part of the stage with his band. And from a musical standpoint, they were very good, and he had a lot of really good characters. But Harry Chapin kind of stormed on the scene in the protest era of the late 60s, early 70s, with basically protest songs of things that he didn't think were very equitable. And he parlayed that fame that he achieved, and his first big breakthrough hit was a song called Taxi, and it's still an absolute classic. It's about a guy who's getting to be a little bit older, who had all these idealist ideas and wanted to be he actually wanted to be a pilot in his teenage years. And Harry writes about being rerouted and going different directions, and just trying to make ends meet, driving a taxi cab in San Francisco, and actually picking up and driving around a woman he had known in high school, that he had gotten a little involved with in every aspect of the word. She had gone on to marry a rich guy, and was living a life that he knew that she didn't aspire to. The song is great, and if you'll remember at the very end, he says, "You see, she was going to be an actress, and I was going to learn to fly." And there she's acting happy inside her handsome home, and me, I'm flying in my taxi, taking tips and getting stoned. That really got kind of big in the protest era of the 60s and 70s, and Harry Chapin suddenly was on the scene musically, signed to a couple of different album deals, recorded an album called Veritas and Balderdash, which was his biggest seller, which included his mega hit song that I know everyone's familiar with. Maybe even if they've forgotten Harry, everybody remembers Cats in the Cradle. And any dad who to this day hears the song Cats in the Cradle talking about his relationship with his son, the lyrics are haunting. It brings perspective to anybody who's a father and thinks about it. I'm going to be like you, Dad. I'm going to be like you. And then when the son grows up, he said, called him up just the other day. I said, I'd like to see you if you don't mind. He said, I'd love to, Dad, if I could find the time. But my new job's a hassle and the kids have the flu. But it's sure nice talking to you, Dad. It's been sure nice talking to you. And as I hung up the phone, it occurred to me, he'd grown up just like me. My boy was just like me. And the cats in the cradle and the silver spoon, the little boy grew like the man in the moon. When you coming home, son, I don't know when. We'll get together then, Dad. We're going to have a good time then. So the script was flipped in the song, and it was a major, major hit. And Harry always joked that He finally got smart after 6 or 7 years on the music scene. Cats in the Cradle was only a 3-minute song, and it got huge play because Harry said he had a problem with being succinct. Most of his songs were 6 minutes and longer, and the excuse that was made a lot of times, well, your songs are just too long. So he finally got into the flow and had a big hit that gave him the visibility to pursue the things that he believed in. And he's also, very interestingly, there was the people that came to that memorial service included Pat Benatar, who became, of course, a mega hit, and it was 100% Harry Chapin that was responsible for that. Harry Chapin went to I guess it was like a dinner theater. It was some kind of local performing kind of a thing, and heard her sing her part in this small town production in upstate New York, and talked to her after the show and told her he really thought she had something and should pursue her talents, and he could make a few phone calls. Long and short of the story is, Harry was such a kind of a ragged guy with all kinds of quirks. And the funny part of that story, after he had talked to her for about a half hour, they brought his tab. He only had 2 beers. And in those days, they're not $15 like they are now. I think his tab, when he told the story, and she told the story in that memorial service, he owed like $6 or something like that. And he started feeling around in his pocket. And he goes, "Oh, damn, I forgot my wallet." So he didn't have a quarter on him. He's sitting there at a bar talking to Pat Benatar, who was nobody had ever heard of. Pat Benatar said, "I didn't have any money back then." She goes, "But I actually had to dig deep in my purse." And she goes, "With quarters and a couple of singles, I was able to get Harry's bar tab and get him off the hook that night." But Harry paid her back big time by getting in touch with his record label and getting her into the mainstream. And she said, the last advice he gave me before I went to audition was, and get in the process, he said, your voice and your look is something that you need to take advantage of. You're doing the wrong kind of music. You need to be a tough girl. He said, you need to develop this hardcore shell exterior and really flaunt that and do that kind of music. And there's no telling how far you can go. I mean, he saw that in her, and that's exactly what, she ended up being. Hit Me With Your Best Shot and We Belong, and so many of the other songs that are really hard core, I guess you could say, with her in that role that Harry advised. And she looks up at the memorial service and points to the heavens and said, "Harry, I think I got it." So there's so many lives this guy impacted. As I told you, he went on to do all kinds of benefits. His band and his family were to the point later in his life where they were literally begging him to cut back on his schedule and to stop hopscotching all over the country at his expense, to support every cause that people asked him to be involved in. He was just tireless, and as I mentioned, was actually very active in Washington, D.C., pestering politicians and sitting on committees. This guy did a lot in the 38 years he was allotted. I also wanted to quickly tell you the day of his death, July 16th, 1981. I was in my early 20s. I had just gotten the job that introduced me basically as an aspiring broadcaster, someone who always wanted to be in the business. I had the opportunity to get the job as the track announcer and radio show host for a racetrack up in the Memphis area. My dad had been transferred there, and I was in my first couple of months as the voice of Southland Greyhound Racing, and I did a results show afterwards and was, really kind of kickstarted earlier than I would have been in having an actual broadcasting opportunity, because I had some pretty distinct ability to describe sporting events. And when greyhounds are running 40 miles an hour, you got to have some some chops to be able to describe that action. I actually ironically met Billy Gibbons, who's on the TKR network in a show capacity as well. Billy loved coming out when he was recording in Memphis for ZZ Top. He loved coming out to our fancy dining area and bringing all of his friends on a Saturday night. And so made a great association there on kind of a side note. But the day that happened, I had not heard about it. We didn't have 24-hour news cycles. I was on my way up the back steps to get up to the broadcast booth for another night of racing. And we had this quirky, odd character that was at the track. I don't know where he got his money. He wore the same sport coat every day. He looked like he was so pale he could light up a room if it was dark. Just a very odd looking guy. And he wore these kind of opera glasses things, had binoculars around his neck. And he bet enough money where they gave him a tiny little office just off a maintenance room, kind of halfway up to the judge's stand, the press box, for lack of a better term. And we would pass on the steps occasionally because he would be coming down from the little space they'd allocated him to formulate his betting strategy. And they gave him a little desk. It was certainly not an office. It was basically just a desk in a maintenance room. But the guy, because he wore those binoculars around his neck, he was known as Binocular Bob. To this day, I don't know what his name was. He was probably about a 50-year-old guy, just a real oddball racetrack character right out of Central Casting. But I never witnessed him speaking to anyone. He certainly never spoke to me, like a 21-year-old punk. But that particular day, coming up the stairwell, Binocular Bob was coming down, and very oddly, I mean, and this is still something that is just a mystifying moment in my life. Binocular Bob just looked at me as we passed on the stairs and said, "Harry Chapin was killed in a traffic accident today." And it just stunned me. This guy is like my hero and somebody who I'd seen in concert literally through my teens and early 20s, 35 or 40 times, including a 2-night deal that went 4 hours for each session, the Harry Chapin Songbook at the Fox Theater, where, of course, all of the proceeds from 2 packed sold-out shows were given to his organization, World Hunger Year. This was a guy that hung around after his shows in the lobby, signing whatever memorabilia or merchandise people bought, all once again donated to various causes. But he'd stand there till the last guy walked out of the room. He was such an extraordinary individual and somebody that I just admired so much. And to hear from this guy who I didn't even know and had never spoken to this day, it's just mystifying. It's almost like it was a heavens delivered message, because it may have been days before I even heard, because at that time, if you didn't read the newspaper from back to front, there was all kinds of stories that you just weren't aware of. So that's another little side angle to it. I wanted to quickly tell you to invest the time on YouTube. I think the anthem that Harry Chapin wrote late in his life, because he even foretold his own demise in this song, but it's called "There Only Was One Choice." And it talks about, in 16-minute fashion, so he knew this one wasn't going to get on the radio, 16 minutes, and I know every lyric by heart. But he talks about being a young man with all these idealistic ideas, and he gets into music, and he gets caught up in it a little bit, riding around in limousines and flying around in Lear jets, and loses sight of kind of his core mission until he, reaches the realization that he needs to use his fame to enhance things he believes in. And it's such a valuable lesson for all of us now. In the song, he said, "I started this song, I was still 33, the age that Mozart died and sweet Jesus was set free. Keats and Shelley too soon finished, Charlie Parker would be, and I fantasize some tragedy be soon curtailing me." Think about that. Pretty ominous that a guy 33 years old at that time was already kind of forecasting his own parting. It goes on to say, "Well, just today I had a birthday. I made it 34. mere mortal, not immortal, not star-crossed anymore. I've got this problem with my aging I no longer can ignore. A tame and toothless tabby can't produce a lion's roar. He also had a famous song that's included in the lyrics of this song called Dance Band on the Titanic. Dance Band on the Titanic, singing Near My God to Thee, the iceberg's on the starboard bow, won't you dance with me? And of course, the message of that song was that, our country is on a collision course. And if we don't steer clear and change our direction, this is a guy 47 years ago in 1976 during the American Bicentennial wrote this song. And a lot of the lyrics are people trying to get their attention that America needs to become a benevolent, charitable country again, and not be self-centered and not be greedy and all about the money. And the lyrics in the song are just extraordinary. The other ones I wanted to tell you about is the passage where he says, "Yes, I read it in the New York Times. It was on newsstands today. It said that dreams are out of fashion. There'll be no more wasted passion. There'll be no more empty promises to clutter up our days. It really is a good thing," the words went on to say. "It shows that we are growing up in so many healthy ways. And I told myself this is exactly where I'm at, but I don't much like thinking about that." Harry, are you really so naive? You can honestly believe that the country's getting better when all you do is let her alone? Harry, can you really be surprised when it's there before your eyes? When you hold the knife that carves her, you live the life that starves her to the bone. But good dreams don't come cheap. You've got to pay for them. If you just dream when you're asleep, there is no way for them to come alive, to survive. And he finishes the song with the great passage that I find myself singing to myself or even out loud a lot of times. I know the people I used to live down on the south side of Birmingham, Park 35, and sit on my balcony and sing. So they're missing those free shows. I'm sorry, folks. I'll give you my new address if you're really missing those free live performances. But at the very end, Harry Chapin finishes that song with, "So I stride down sunny streets and the band plays back my song. They're applauding at my shadow long after I am gone. Should I hold this wistful notion that my journey is worthwhile, then tiptoe cross the chasm with a song and a smile. Well, I got up this morning, I don't need to know no more. It evaporated nightmares that had boiled the night before. With every new day's dawning, my kid climbs in my bed and tells the cynics from the boardroom, your language is dead. And as I wander with my music through these jungles of despair, my kid will learn guitar and find his street corner somewhere. There he'll make the silence listen to the dream behind the voice and show his minstrel Hamlet daddy that there only was one choice." And the very end is, "So strum your guitar, sing it, kid. Just write about your feelings, not the things you never did. Inexperience, it once had cursed me, but your youth is no handicap. It's what makes you thirsty. Hey, kid." And then he concludes with, "Dance band on the Titanic, singing near my God to thee. And the iceberg's on the starboard bow. Won't you dance with me?" Of course, that's a tribute to the Titanic dance band that came up on deck when things were imperiled and decided to play that song to try and create some calm and perspective in the light of the greatest tragedy that imaginable in 1912. I think that we are approaching the iceberg if we have not already made contact, and everybody should heed the example of the great Harry Chapin, get into his music a little bit, go back and refresh yourself on exactly what he was trying to tell us 47 years ago at the time that he wrote that song, and just 5 years later in his very untimely but his own personally forecasted demise Harry Chapin. I wanted to highlight him on this show, go a little bit different direction. I hope some things in here caught your interest. It's a character that fascinates me, and I'm glad to have had the...
This has been a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio.